Charleston, South Carolina, fall of 2019. The kitchen was warm with the smell of chicken noodle soup drifting through the air, the gentle hum of the old TV in the living room carrying the evening news. Victor sat at the table, spoon in hand, staring at his bowl as if it had personally offended him. Without looking at me, he said, "You're not the woman I married." The words landed like a cold slap. I stood there for a moment, the wooden spoon still in my hand, before setting it down on the counter. I didn't yell. I didn't demand an explanation. Instead, I walked past him, through the hallway into the bedroom, and reached for the old photo album that had been gathering dust on the top shelf of the closet. The cover was worn, the edges frayed from years of handling, though it had been a long time since I'd last opened it. I carried it to the bed, sat down, and flipped to the first page. There we were, Victor and I on our wedding day. I was in white, smiling so hard my cheeks hurt just looking at the picture. My hair was thick and dark, my eyes bright. He was tall and lean back then, with that easy smile I used to think was just for me. Page after page, I watched us change: vacations to the mountains, Christmas mornings with the kids, the first house we bought together. Somewhere in those photos, the man I married started to fade into someone else. And I suppose I changed too, but not in the way he meant. 60 now, I'm the kind of woman who can fix a leaking faucet, stretch a dollar, and keep a family together through storms, literal and otherwise. I'm direct, I have a sharp sense of humor, and I don't scare easily. Victor, at 62, still expects the world to revolve around him, but lately he's been distant, cold. I used to think it was stress, maybe his health. Now I wasn't so sure. I closed the album and returned to the kitchen. He was staring at his phone, not even pretending to eat. As I walked past, the screen lit up with a message: "Can't wait to see you tonight, honey." My eyes caught the name, Melissa. I kept moving, pretending I hadn't noticed. I opened the cupboard, reached for the tea bags, and asked if he wanted a cup. He mumbled something about going to the garage later to check on the boat, which I knew meant disappearing for hours. While the kettle boiled, I leaned against the counter and watched him out of the corner of my eye. There was something different in the way he scrolled through his messages, the way he smirked slightly at the screen. I'd seen that look before, decades ago when he was younger and trying to impress me. Only now it wasn't for me. He finished his soup quickly, set the bowl in the sink without rinsing it, and left the kitchen. I stayed where I was, sipping my tea, letting the pieces rearrange themselves in my mind. The late nights. The sudden concern for how he dressed. The new cologne that I never bought for him. Later, when he headed out to the garage, I sat in the living room and thought about the years we'd spent together, the good, the bad, the mundane. I thought about how we'd weathered job losses, health scares, and raising children. And now, after 40 years, it wasn't enough for him. Maybe it wasn't about my hair being grayer or my body not being what it once was. Maybe it was about him chasing some version of himself that never really existed. When he finally came home, smelling faintly of perfume that definitely wasn't mine, I didn't say a word. I smiled, asked how the boat was, and let him talk. Inside, I was already making a decision. I wasn't going to confront him, not yet. That would give him the drama, the scene, the satisfaction of thinking he'd rattled me. No, I was going to wait. I went back to the bedroom, slid the photo album onto the shelf, and stood there for a moment in the quiet. The house felt different now, like the air had shifted. He thought he knew who I was, thought I'd react the way I always had. But I'm not the same woman he married, and maybe that's the problem. You want another woman? I thought to myself as I turned off the light and got into bed. Fine. Let's see which one of us isn't the same anymore. The next morning, I decided to stop running the marriage on autopilot and start paying closer attention. 4 years, I'd been so focused on keeping the house running smoothly that I'd stopped noticing the little things about Victor. Now those little things were all I could see. I made mental notes of the times he left and came home, the clothes he wore, even the way he smelled when he walked through the door. He used to come back from the garage smelling like motor oil and sawdust. Lately it was different. Twice that week he claimed he had a lot of work to do on the boat, but he came home in a freshly ironed shirt, no grease under his nails, and wearing a cologne I didn't recognize, expensive, sharp, and completely out of place for tinkering with tools. I couldn't help but picture him polishing a wrench in that shirt, which was about as believable as me mowing the lawn in high heels. I didn't confront him. Instead, I took my time and let the picture develop. In the afternoons, I'd sit on the porch with a cup of tea, pretending to read and watch him leave. I noticed the slight swagger in his walk, the way he checked his reflection in the truck's side mirror before getting in. It was the kind of behavior you expect from a teenager on his way to prom, not a man in his 60s heading to fix the engine. It wasn't long before Linda got involved, though not intentionally. Linda lives 2 houses down and treats the neighborhood like her personal news network. She stopped by one morning under the pretense of returning a pie dish, but within minutes she was telling me about running into Victor downtown. He was over on King Street, she said casually, right near that fancy steakhouse. With a lady. Pretty young thing, long hair, nice legs, but she sure wasn't you. She laughed, not realizing she'd just handed me the missing piece of the puzzle. I thanked her, kept my face neutral, and made a mental note that Victor's garage trips now included prime rib and fine wine. It was almost funny in a pathetic way. I could practically hear my grandmother's voice saying, "Old stallions with a new saddle still limp in the morning." The next time he announced he was heading to work on the boat, I let him go. Later I checked the laundry basket. His shirt smelled faintly of perfume, not the kind you buy at the corner drugstore but the heavy, lingering kind you only get at department store counters where they spray it on you like they're marking territory. I pressed my nose to the fabric, shaking my head. If he was going to cheat, the least he could do was learn how to hide the evidence properly. Over the next week, I confirmed what I'd already suspected. The new cologne, the cleaner clothes, the uptick in garage time, all of it pointed to someone else. It wasn't hard to figure out that she was younger too. A man like Victor wasn't going to risk all that sneaking around for someone in the same chapter of life as me. He was chasing a version of himself that didn't exist anymore, the kind of man who could keep up with a woman 20 years younger. The realization didn't hurt the way I thought it would. It didn't break me or send me crying into a pillow. Instead, it lit a spark. The kind of spark that made me want to see how far he'd go if he thought I was still in the dark. Men like Victor are at their sloppiest when they feel untouchable. I was going to let him feel that way just long enough to step right into whatever mess he was making. So I smiled when he came home late. I asked polite questions about the boat, nodded at his vague answers, and made sure he saw me busy with my own plans. In the mornings, I'd hum while making coffee, like a woman who had no reason to suspect anything. And every night, I'd lie in bed next to him, knowing exactly where he'd been and exactly what I was going to do about it, when the time was right. I decided it was time to shift the balance. For weeks, I had been watching Victor's movements like a hawk, but now I wanted him to feel watched without knowing why. The first change was in my appearance. I booked a haircut, added some highlights and started wearing clothes that made me feel sharp and put together. Not glamorous, just polished in a way he hadn't seen in years. In the mornings, I left the house without long explanations, grabbing my purse and keys with a casual, "I've got things to do." Sometimes I came back in the afternoon, sometimes well after dark. I made sure I smelled faintly of a perfume he didn't recognize. At first, Victor barely reacted, but after a week I could see the cracks. He would ask offhand questions. "Where were you?" or "Who were you with?" But I gave vague answers. I kept my tone light, as if I were too busy to notice his curiosity. The more I seemed unavailable, the more unsettled he became. I could tell he didn't like that my world was no longer orbiting around him. One afternoon I was at a small cafe downtown, sipping coffee and reading on my tablet when I heard my name. I looked up and there was Tom, an old friend of the family we hadn't seen much in recent years. He was grinning like he'd just spotted trouble. We chatted for a while, catching up on kids, health and life in general. At some point he leaned in and said with a chuckle, "Does Victor know you're out here looking like this? You're going to give him a heart attack." I laughed it off, but in the back of my mind I knew that if word of our meeting reached Victor, it would add just the right kind of fuel to the fire. Tom had a way of talking that stuck in people's minds, and I had no doubt he'd casually mention our run-in if he saw Victor around. That evening, I came home to find Victor in the living room, flipping channels with more force than necessary. He didn't say anything, but I could feel the air between us had shifted again. The more I quietly occupied my own life, the more he seemed off balance. A few days later, while tidying up the office, I noticed the bottom drawer of the desk was locked. Victor had never kept anything locked at home, not from me at least. The key wasn't hard to find. It was sitting in the catch-all dish by the front door, mixed in with spare change and an old watch battery. Inside the drawer was a neat stack of folders. I hesitated only for a second before pulling them out. The first few were nothing: old tax returns, warranties for appliances. Then I found it. A folder with property documents, all in pristine condition, neatly signed. My stomach tightened as I read the names. Victor's on the seller's side and on the buyer's side, Melissa. The Melissa from the text message. The property wasn't here in South Carolina, it was in Florida. A condo in a coastal town, perfect for weekend getaways or a new life altogether. I flipped through more pages and found a signed power of attorney granting her rights to manage certain assets. I sat there for a moment, letting it all settle. This wasn't just a fling, this was a full-scale transfer of loyalty, resources, and plans. He was building something with her that he had once promised to build with me. The old me might have confronted him right then and there, waving the papers in his face. But the woman I had become knew better. I returned everything exactly as I'd found it, locked the drawer and put the key back in the dish. My heart wasn't racing and I didn't feel like crying. Instead, a strange calm settled over me. It was the kind of calm you feel when you know the outcome of a game before the other player even realizes they're losing. That night, I made his favorite dinner, poured him a glass of wine and asked about his day. He answered in vague sentences, probably thinking he was still pulling the strings. I smiled and nodded, already outlining my next steps in my mind. It was time to act, not with shouting matches or slammed doors but with precision. Quiet, deliberate moves that would leave him wondering when exactly he lost control. The silent game was ending. My turn was coming and when it did, it would be checkmate. The following Monday, I walked into a law office downtown without telling anyone where I was going. The receptionist offered me coffee, but my mind was already racing ahead to what I needed to do. The attorney, a sharp woman in her 40s named Rachel, listened patiently as I laid out the situation. I didn't sugarcoat it: Victor's affair, the Florida condo, the transfer of assets. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said, "You're smart to get ahead of this." Her plan was straightforward: secure what's mine before he can touch it. Within the week, I'd signed papers transferring one of our jointly owned rental properties into the name of my nephew Mark. He'd been like a son to me since he was little, and I knew he'd protect it. Next came the bank accounts. All our savings were sitting in one institution, under both our names. I opened new accounts at a credit union across town, moving the money in increments so it wouldn't trigger attention. Rachel set it up so the transfers looked like regular withdrawals for expenses. It was a strange mix of business-like detachment and deep satisfaction. I wasn't just reacting, I was building something solid for myself while quietly dismantling his safety net. At night, I slept better than I had in months, even with him snoring in the next room. One afternoon, my friend Carol stopped by for coffee. We sat at the kitchen table, the autumn light slanting in through the blinds. She asked if everything was okay, noting I'd been busier than usual. I just smiled and said I'd been taking care of some loose ends. Carol raised an eyebrow but didn't press. She knows me well enough to recognize when I've set my mind to something. My grandson Ethan noticed too. One Saturday, I was going through a folder of documents at the dining table when he came in from the backyard. "Grandma, why are you working on so many papers lately?" he asked. I grinned and told him I was learning how to live smarter. He didn't understand, but I could see he liked the sound of it. Kids sense when adults are taking charge, even if they don't know the details. The real fun came with the dinner invitation. I called Victor and told him I thought it would be nice for him and his friend to join me for a family meal. I could hear the hesitation in his voice, but curiosity won out. He agreed, probably imagining he'd be showing her off. I went all out on the dinner: roast chicken, fresh bread, and a pie cooling on the counter. When they arrived, I greeted them warmly, like a hostess with no hidden agenda. Melissa was younger, polished, wearing a dress that probably cost more than my entire grocery budget for the month. Victor looked smug, at least until midway through the meal. We were chatting about housing prices, and I slipped it in as casually as if I were mentioning the weather. "Oh, I sold one of the condos last week. Honestly, it feels so good, one less thing to worry about." You can't put a price on peace of mind. I kept my eyes on my plate as I said it, but I could feel Victor stiffen across the table. Melissa nodded politely, clearly not catching the subtext. I poured more wine, changed the subject, and let the moment pass as if it were nothing. But from then on, Victor was quieter. He laughed at the right moments, but his mind was somewhere else, probably doing mental math and wondering which property I meant. After they left, I stood at the sink, rinsing plates and watching the streetlight flicker outside. I knew he was starting to suspect that his careful plans weren't as airtight as he'd thought. But he still didn't know just how far ahead I was. The queen had moved and the board was already shifting in my favor. Victor didn't waste much time after that dinner. 2 days later, he cornered me in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed like he was about to deliver some grand ultimatum. His voice was low but firm as he told me we needed to talk about the property situation. I let him go on about how selling anything without consulting him was a breach of trust, how joint assets were supposed to be exactly that, joint. He clearly thought a little pressure would make me confess to whatever he imagined I'd done. I didn't bother to argue. Instead, I walked into the study, opened the desk drawer and pulled out a thin folder. Without a word, I set it in front of him. Inside were copies of all the legal transfers. Mark's name now on the rental property deed, the new bank account statements from the credit union, the withdrawal slips. His eyes moved quickly over the pages, but his face said more than any words could. This wasn't the reaction of a man surprised by a small change. This was a man watching his safety net vanish thread by thread. He looked up at me trying to mask his panic. "You can't just," he started, but I cut him off with a calm, steady tone. "I can, and I did. You've been busy building a future with someone else. I've been busy making sure I still have one of my own." There was nothing left for him to say. He closed the folder slowly as if that might change what was inside, and left the room without another word. A week later I was gone. Not to a friend's house, not to some relative's spare bedroom, but to a spa resort on the Gulf Coast of Florida. I booked an ocean view suite for an entire month. While Victor was trying to figure out how to juggle bills and explain to Melissa why certain promises couldn't be kept, I was getting morning massages and drinking fresh orange juice on a balcony overlooking the water. Mark called me halfway through my stay with good news. He'd signed the lease for his new woodworking shop. The rental income from the property I'd given him covered most of his overhead, and the rest he was making up with his savings. I could hear the pride in his voice and it made me smile. This wasn't just about protecting myself, it was about putting something good into hands that would actually use it well. As for Victor, word reached me through a mutual acquaintance that Melissa had left. Apparently, her enthusiasm for him cooled once she realized the Florida condo wasn't going to magically fall into her lap. She left behind a few dresses in his closet and a note on the kitchen counter that said, "I need someone who can keep their promises." Short and to the point. I didn't feel sorry for him. Actions have a way of circling back, and he'd just gotten his turn. Still, when I returned home, I called and asked him to meet me down by the marina. It was early evening, the air crisp, the water catching the last orange streaks of the sunset. He arrived looking thinner, older, like the weight of the last month had finally settled on him. We stood there for a moment in silence before I finally said, "You were right, you're not married to the same woman you met all those years ago." His eyes flickered with something, maybe hope, maybe regret, until I added, "Now I'm better." I didn't raise my voice or make it dramatic. I wanted the words to land quietly, the way truth often does. I turned and walked along the pier, the wind catching my hair, the sound of the water lapping against the pilings. The night lights of the harbor began to glow, and I felt lighter than I had in years. After 40 years of marriage, you can either quietly fade away, letting life shrink around you, or you can step forward into something new. I chose the latter. Respect in a marriage isn't a bonus you get for good behavior. It's the foundation that holds everything up. Once it's gone, you either rebuild on your own terms or watch the whole structure collapse. Age doesn't mean you settle for less. It means you finally know exactly what you deserve. And as I walked away from the man who had once been my whole world, I knew I was stepping into a life built on dignity, self-respect, and the freedom to live it fully. Dear viewers, thank you for being with us. Subscribe to the channel, like us, and be sure to write in the comments what you think of this story. Don't forget to click on the bell, so you don't miss new interesting stories. See you soon.